Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I'm going to be talking about Swooping Hawks in 10th edition Warhammer 40k, how and why they are suddenly back after spending several months at the aspect shrines, polishing their beaky masks and staring longingly at the clouds. They were on spring break, summer break, I guess. But no longer. Increasingly, Swooping Hawks have been showing up in virtually all of the lists, making it to the podiums in major GTs, and this is because of some pretty significant changes to the meta and some changes to the rules, and I will go into those in just a moment. But first, I will acknowledge that this is another short-form video. I'm experimenting with some short-form videos, which to me means videos ideally under 20 minutes, definitely no more than 25. Because that's something that people have been asking for pretty much since I started the channel. But fear not, long-form video lovers, they're not gone. This is an also edition, not an instead of edition. Okay, let's talk Hawks. So Swooping Hawks were very popular in 9th edition, and many of you are probably sitting on, therefore, lots of Hawk models, because in 9th edition there were ways to, with overlapping buffs, have them do rather insane amounts of damage and just not die and just be virtually unkillable. And that is not how they function in 10th edition. So those of you who haven't played in a while and are coming back with your 9th edition armies, the good news is you can use your Hawks. The bad news is, well, it's not bad news. The exciting news is you get to learn a new way to play with them. For one thing, Hawks are no longer showing up in the blocks of 10 that we were seeing in the last edition. They pretty exclusively show up in 5s, and that's because they are not a tool for massed fire. They are a tool for board control and for trading. In the beginning of 10th edition, Hawks were not finding their way into lists simply because Eldar armies were winning by tabling their opponent on turn 3, in some cases on turn 2. You didn't need tactical scoring units if you could just pick up all of your opponent's toys before they had an opportunity to smack you back with any serious force. But now that our most broken weapons, the mortal wounds on the big wraith cannons, now that those have been reined in, we need to think differently about how we play the game. We need to think a lot more about tactical scoring, and this is where Swooping Hawks excel. So the primary use for Hawks is secondary objective scoring. This is what they really excel at. Of the 16 possible secondary mission cards that you can draw, Hawks are invaluable for 8 of them. And of those 8, 4 are also fixed objectives. So if you are playing with fixed objectives, which is becoming more and more popular in the meta, Hawks are essentially an auto-include. So what makes Hawks so good at this? 2 things. One, their incredible mobility combined with their disposability. They're only 75 points for 5 of them, which means you can completely afford to throw away a squad of Hawks to score some victory points or to deny victory points to your opponent. Now, I know that some of you out there listening to this have just an aesthetic, lore-based, spiritual disgust with the notion that any elf life is disposable, and I agree with you. But a good autarch also knows that saving the most elf lives sometimes requires some sacrifice. We'll stick their spirit stones into the infinity circuit. Don't worry, they'll live on with their ancestors. But you may find yourself, if you're including Hawks in your army, on a pretty regular basis, trading one or more of those units of Hawks to max out secondary objective points. So they have a 14-inch move, and they can advance, therefore, 14 plus d6. And if you really needed to, you could use a stratagem and guarantee that they could advance 20. Or you could, of course, use Strands of Fate to get whatever roll you need if there's some place on the board that they need to get with that initial move. And that's really good. That's really fast. It's not quite as fast as Warp Spiders can be, but remember that Warp Spiders are 115 points now to the Hawks 75. So it's a pretty significant savings to include Hawks instead of Warp Spiders. I would say the big difference between the Hawks and the Warp Spiders A, the warp spiders are just a little faster out of the gate, but B, warp spiders hit a little bit harder, and they're more expensive. And a lot of lists are running both. For a long time, I thought of Hawks and Warp Spiders as kind of an either or, but a lot of top players are running 10 Warp Spiders and 10 Hawks, both in 2 squads of 5, or in some cases, maybe 10 Warp Spiders and 5 Hawks. But having multiple squads of these fast, relatively inexpensive soldiers means that you have, every turn, you have something that you can dispose of to score without giving up tools that you really need. But it isn't just that 14-inch move plus the advance and I can still shoot thing that makes Hawks good. It's also the Sky Leap ability. So at the end of your opponent's turn, if this unit is not within engagement range of enemy units, you can pick them up and put them into strategic reserves. So you pick them up at the end of your opponent's turn, and then you just deep strike them in on your turn, right? They have deep strike as a core ability. You can bring them in anywhere within 9 inches of an enemy unit, but then of course you can shoot with them and phantasm them for a single CP, such that they don't have to be 9 inches from an enemy unit, which means that they're just ridiculously mobile. You can drop them into your opponent's backfield to score if you need to. They can shoot something, they can move. It doesn't really matter where you start them on the board. You can start them in deep strike if you need to, so they're not taking up valuable real estate in your own backfield when you deploy. You can only fit so many units out of line of sight in your backfield, and Hawks don't necessarily need to be one of those if you start them in deep strike, which is a solid way to play with them. But the ability to essentially re-deep strike with them every single turn it's from a scoring perspective, it's just great. It can also be good from a screening perspective. There's certainly other things you can do with them, but from a scoring perspective, it's just so good. So the 8 secondaries, I want to briefly talk about each of these that they're so helpful with, are in some cases secondaries that can otherwise be sort of hard to pull off. One of them, of course, is Engage on All Fronts. Engage is similar to how it was in the previous edition, but it's not totally identical. If you have one or more qualifying units wholly within 3 table quarters, and they have to be at least 3 inches away from other table quarters, you score 4 victory points. If you can only get 3 victory points, or only 3 table quarters, you get 2 victory points. But if you're using this as a non-tactical, I'm sorry, if you're using this as a tactical mission rather than a fixed mission, you get +1. So then it's 5 and 3. Well, you pretty much always have 2 table quarters just automatically with Eldar, and it's not too hard to get a third, but oftentimes there is 1 table quarter that's quite challenging to get. Dropping a unit of Hawks into that table quarter, which is pretty easy either by just moving them in with their 14-inch plus D6 move, which you can, of course, rig with a fate die or a stratagem, or deep striking them in, but then phantasming with them after you shoot. Or if you really have to do it same turn, you can use 2 CP on Fire and Fade to get them where they need to be to score. That makes the odds of you being able to get the top score on this significantly greater. It's a crazy good insurance policy for Engage on All Fronts. It also gives you the opportunity, I think, if you have a bunch of Hawks in your army, if you're running multiple units of Hawks and multiple units of Warp Spiders, you could potentially run Engage on All Fronts as one of your fixed objectives. The secondary mission, Deploy Teleport Homer, gives you victory points for performing an action either within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield or in your opponent's deployment zone. If you do it in the center of the battlefield, it's 2 CP, 2 VP, or 3 if you're drawing into it as a tactical objective. If you do it in your opponent's deployment zone, it's 4 VP or 5 if you're using tactical missions. Well, you have all sorts of space elves that can get to the middle of the board, but being able to get into your opponent's backfield and do this into your opponent's deployment zone, 5 VP is a pretty big swing. And because Hawks have assault weapons, they can make if you use either a fate die or that other strat, they can make a 20-inch move into your opponent's deployment zone, or a 20-inch move into your opponent's deployment zone, and then perform the action instead of shooting, because they have an assault weapon. They're still eligible to shoot after making an advanced move, which means they are still eligible to deploy Teleport Homers. It's so good. Behind enemy lines is deploy teleport homers, of course. Also, again, if you were to go with fixed objectives, you definitely would want multiple units of Hawks, because deploy teleport homers is one of those things that you could guarantee on scoring with every turn. Behind enemy lines is similar in that it rewards you for having units in your opponent's backfield, but they don't have to perform actions, but you need to have multiple units to max it out. So you get, if you have 2 or more units, you can score 4 points if it's fixed, 5 points if it's tactical. If you only have 1, you're scoring 2 or 3 if it's tactical. But I don't think you're likely to take behind enemy lines in most games as a fixed objective, but I do think that this is a great one for Hawks, in part because it has such good synergy with the Yin Karn, which I really love running and is appearing in a lot of competitive lists. If you have the opportunity to move your Yin Karn into your opponent's backfield, maybe because, say, you killed something with a Night Spinner, some fragile out-of-the-way infantry unit, you also drop your Hawks in, that gives you your 2 units. There are, of course, other units you can get back there, but Hawks will often be the more disposable of the 2 units you drop for the 5 VP. And even if you don't quite have the movement to get in initially, remember that you can always pull the Fire and Fade trick if you really have to. Well, Phantasm's on your opponent's turn, so less so with Phantasm. But if you Fire and Fade with the Hawks, they end up making a normal move after they shoot, and because they can advance and shoot, potentially they could be moving 34 inches in a single turn. They're also good for secure no man's land. This is just rewards you for taking objectives in no man's land. You don't necessarily need Hawks for this, but Eldar are a very powerful shooting army in this edition. And if you blow an enemy unit off of a midfield objective that's pretty close to your opponent's backfield, you might not actually be able to move anything there except for Hawks or Warp Spiders. But you can shoot enemies off a faraway objective, and your Hawks can get there to get you the VP that you need. Investigate Signals is another one. This is just a great one for Hawks. You get 2 VP for every corner of the battlefield where you have an enemy unit that is wholly within 9 inches and doesn't shoot and performs an action. This is a great one for Hawks because obviously the ability to just put them back into Deep Strike means that you can potentially have multiple units of Hawks in Deep Strike. You can usually get 2 corners of the battlefield without having anything like Hawks, but having a unit of Hawks can get you to 6, or in some cases even 8, depending on what the field looks like if you have multiple units, and that's really potent. It's really good. Extend battle lines is another one if you need to jump onto a hard-to-reach objective in the midfield. And much like Secure No Man's Land, I didn't say this when I mentioned Secure No Man's Land, the reason to use Hawks to jump on to that midfield objective to score these is that they're only 75 points. So when your opponent inevitably shoots them off on your opponent's turn, it doesn't really matter. You can afford to throw away your Hawks to score. And they also theoretically will get a round of shooting in. And their shooting isn't bad. I'll talk about their shooting at the end. Storm Hostile Objective is another one. Hawks are also good for Capture Enemy Outpost, which is a secondary mission that people actually throw away a lot. This is the one that you get 8 victory points if you can take the objective in your opponent's deployment zone. Oftentimes this just isn't possible, but if you have Night Spinners, right, in Force, and a lot of lists are running Night Spinners in Force, you may have the ability to pick up whatever is on the objective in your opponent's backfield. You can drop Hawks in there using the Deep Strike ability. You can do some damage to whatever's holding the objective, but then potentially Fire and Fade the Hawks onto the objective in your opponent's backfield, even if they had to start 9 inches away, and then you finish, you get the OC value right. You know, that whole squad of Hawks is going to have objective control of 5. You have to get your opponent down below that, and the shooting from the Night Spinners and the shooting from the Hawks themselves may very well be enough to do that. And eight points is a pretty big swing. You, of course, can also potentially do this with a Yin Karn if you can kill the whole squad, but it's sometimes eight victory points is a lot. You might find yourself wanting to do it, but it can still suck to have to get your Yin Karn killed in order to score this, which is often the choice you face. It's like, well, I can probably do that, but my opponent still has enough in the backfield to kill the Eldar God of Death, and so maybe I don't want to. Hawks are a great alternative to that. The last one that they're really good for is a tempting target. This is the one that lets your opponent choose a objective marker in no man's land and say you have to take that one. And this is another one where people often just throw it away for the VP because your opponent can just choose the thing that's too far away that you can't get anything to. But Hawks can get there. Hawks are fast. Warp Spiders can get there too, but when your Hawks die, it's a 75-point loss instead of a 115-point loss. So they're really good at getting you points. And it is for this reason that a lot of competitive GT lists that are now no longer relying on just killing everything that their opponent has, but have to be clever about scoring, are choosing to include often as many as 2 MSU, minimum sized units, of Swooping Hawks. But they do 2 more things. Their shooting is not bad. Each Hawk has 4 attacks, a 4-attack assault, weapon, gun, and then the Exarch has 4 attacks too. But while the regular Hawk Las Blasters are strength 4, the Exarch's Hawk's Talon is strength 5, and because all of these things have lethal hits, your 6s to hit are auto wounding anything. So the whole squad is putting out 20 shots, 4 of which probably are just automatically wounding. They're hitting on 3s, which is good, and then the elevated strength means that they are really good at clearing chaff, and increasingly in the meta, we are seeing more swarm units. Right, there are more termagants than there used to be. There are in fact actual targets. We're moving away from the monster and tank hammer, the kind of exclusively monster and tank hammer that we were seeing in the first few months of the game, especially now that you can't just massacre swarm units with mortal wounds via devastating wounds. And that means that there are going to be matchups in which your Hawk's shooting is actually very valuable as shooting, and you can keep them alive with Phantasm. They can jump into the midfield, shoot a thing, Phantasm behind a wall, and potentially function a little bit the way they did in the last edition. And even if there aren't any great targets for them, the fact that they have volume of fire and lethal hits means that your Hawks can pretty reliably put a few wounds on just about anything. It might not be a lot, but they can ding a tank or a monster for 2-3 wounds, and that's no bad thing. And because they're more than strength 3, they're pretty effective against light infantry, and they can do a few wounds to heavy infantry. And again, because they're so fast and so cheap, you can afford to use them just as a screening unit. So this is an advanced play technique. But if you see, for example, if you look at the board and you can say to yourself, okay, turn 1, I know that my opponent is going to move that Chaos Rhino onto that objective this many inches from my opponent's deployment zone. You could, with your Hawks on turn 1, get out in front of it and move block them, right? In some cases, it might even be, if you have to fire and fade them to do it for the 2CP, it might even be worth it if it's like a 10-point swing in victory points, because maybe you're controlling more than your opponent and they're going to lose 5 and you're going to get 5. Like, there are moments where it makes sense to do that. If you can tie up some big monster that needs to get to the midfield, at 75 points, they're reasonably disposable. And because they have that 5-up invuln, probably, even though they're only toughness 3 and they've only got a 4-up save, it's pretty easy to get cover in 10th edition. And even if you can't get them cover with the 5-up invuln, your opponent is not likely to be able to just wipe them out with Overwatch, unless, of course, they have something that auto hits, like a Flamer, and that is something to watch out for. So they are primarily a scoring unit, but they do have a little bit extra utility as a trading unit, as a blocking unit, and there's no reason not to give the Exarch the Aedari power sword, 3 attacks, -2 AP. Like, that isn't nothing. You know, they have a little bit of game in close combat. 2, so potentially against a light infantry squad, if you can shoot it and then charge it, actually the damage output on the Hawks can be pretty good, even if it's a big squad, a squad of 20 of something. They can really mess it up. Okay, so that's what I've got. If you have not liked the video, I hope you will like it. If you have not subscribed, I hope you will subscribe. I'm really looking forward to crossing the 10,000 subscriber line. I have something special lined up for when we do that I'm very excited about and hoping to be able to reveal soon. So if you could help me get there, I would appreciate it. I always like comments. I love hearing from you, and it helps the algorithm. I'll be back again soon with more content. Take care.